So, good morning everyone. I hope all is well and you're taking good care of your health. So, let's start this session with a very positive thing that I have for you, and this would describe that how you must behave when you have all such knowledge, information. Now, since you are studying a lot now, almost every subject that you have studied, I am sure this is not only the information or the objective learning that we are doing, but the learning of how to live the life. And even the challenging times that have come these days, we are all striving hard to keep ourselves ahead, not only for these studies, but in life also. We are trying to keep up the pace. And the lines that I am going to utter is just to see that what we should aim. It goes like, Nripatvam, Daivatvam, Vidvatvam, Na Tulyam Kadachana. Swadeshe Raja Pujyate, Vidwan Pujyate Sarvatra. It means there are some attributes of yours or of someone who can be a king, and there are attributes of you to be known as a learned or a wise person. So, if a king is there, he would be revered in his own kingdom. But if there is a wise person, if you are that wise person, if you are that learned person, you have that etiquette, you have all those etiquettes, you have that knowledge, you will be respected everywhere you go. And that is what you are trying to strive. Like, maybe when you enter these services, it is not only that you are entering the services and you must be respected. I don't think that this is the case. The case should be that you enter the services and you are respected not because you have just entered the services, but because you had all those qualities. You are striving day and night to help those people who are in need. And when we see today our country, of course you can find out many avenues where we can try to help them. And for them only, I think we should strive hard to let's maybe change the system, or maybe once entering the system you will have all sort of avenues with you where you can reach to them. Today maybe we feel that we cannot try to have that effect, but although it is said that anywhere that we have or we live, we can always have the effect. And I am sure all of you have that charming personality that you will have good positive effect in others' lives. And yes, all of you are in those books, no, I have posed trust in you. I had few messages coming in, sir, are you posing trust in me? I do. But just the thing is, no, you will have to leave everything, just pick up your studies, just aim to only one thing that you have to do right now, and the next year you would be having everything that you have left right now, you will have everything come back to you and you can enjoy that. So just these days of preparation, prelims, mains and the interview, that is all, and you get your ever dreaming, or that you have been dreaming about your services. Yesterday I had asked you questions, and of course I am getting a lot of answers these days. Some of you have always been right, some of you have been trying to be right, some of you ask me even that, okay, am I right or not? So let's see. The first question that I asked you was about a very simple article that you already know about, that is your article 105. So talks about the privileges for the parliamentarians, this you all know about. Mains examination, they have asked questions on this. The codification of it, has the time come? Why these privileges are given? Are they also a hindrance? So all these questions might be there, so analysis you can do for the mains examination. Then I asked you, if suppose the president, now we yesterday talked about that the disqualification can be done under two heads. One is your non-10th schedule and the other one is your 10th schedule. For the 10th schedule, you found out that the speaker is responsible here, or the presiding officer. Here you found out in the non-10th schedule that president in consultation with the election commission would try to find out for the disqualification. Now please understand, if this has been done, or suppose MP, member of parliament, has been disqualified for certain practices, and the president disqualifies that parliamentarian, still you can avail, or that parliamentarian or the MP can avail the route of judiciary. It can avail the route of judiciary, and it's very logical. Although there was a consultation with Election Commission, President has disqualified, but still the judicial route will be open and the review can be done. Now again, on this only I want to ask you a question which might confuse you in the examination. Now see how they would ask you. Statement they could ask you is, President can disqualify the members of legislative assemblies and parliament, or maybe if I say of Lok Sabha and Lok Sabha, after consultation with EC. Now if they ask you this, I want you to answer me what will be your answer in this statement, that the president can disqualify the members of legislative assemblies and Lok Sabha after consulting or after consultation with the EC. Now you have to answer me this question. Second, if they ask you about president can only disqualify members of parliament after consultation with EC. This is another statement that you have to tell me, that president can only disqualify members of parliament after consultation with EC. If you get this statement. Third statement, if you get, suppose it is, you get the third statement as, the president has the power to disqualify the members of parliament in consultation with EC, and this is restricted only to the parliament. The president has the power to disqualify the members of parliament in consultation with EC, and this power is restricted only to the parliament. So these are the three sort of modifications that I am offering you. Please, these are very easy. You just have to let me know what the answer could be. You just have to understand, no, they are not going to ask you a simple question. Now over the years, please see, they write a big statement, and the first statement that they have written, just seeing that you would mark your answer. But the real trap was at the end of the statement where they have written something. So the president has the power to disqualify the members of the parliament in consultation with EC, you saw this, and this is restricted only to the parliament. So please understand the statement as they are giving and try to find out what the answer could be. So here the president has the power to, please, all these three statements I need an answer from you. Then I also talked about plea bargaining. Although I am not that much, or there is no such possibility of this to come in prelims examination, but in mains you can always use it. So plea bargaining, a very easy concept that would mean that, suppose if this person X is charged with A, B, C, suppose it's charged with A, B and C. Plea bargaining would mean that, no, not for the heinous crimes. Of course, this plea bargaining would not be for the heinous crimes, but plea bargaining can be done. Suppose there are 3 charges pressed against this person X, under the provision of plea bargaining, what can be done is he will have to admit, or he will have to say that, okay, I take these as my charges. I admit that, okay, I have committed this, and this, according to this, please allow me to pass on or to start the process of plea bargaining. The least or the quantum, the least of the quantum from these he would pick up. Okay, I may say that, okay, of C charges I can accept. Now let's start this plea bargaining. So what happens is, already when you admit to, now if suppose he does not admit this, all these 3 charges would be going on and the cases would run on and on. What happens in plea bargaining? He would say that, okay, I admit to the least quantum of the charges that I might have done. So you can penalize me according to that. So this would reduce the burden, and this starts with your district court itself. This starts with your district court itself. It starts with the district court itself. So plea bargaining starts with the district court itself. Okay, now coming to the topics of the day, let's see what we have. We can talk about a question that might come on delimitation commission. Delimitation commission. Delimitation commission. And they could ask you, or maybe these are straightforward questions they could ask you here is, we have heard about a delimitation commission for Jammu and Kashmir, and it is said that after every census there would be a setup of delimitation commission. Whether it is going to increase the seat or not, that is another matter, we'll see. But delimitation commission can be set up after every census. Now see what type of questions can come out of it. Who appoints this? Who appoints the Delimitation Commission of India or Delimitation Commission? It is your President of India. The President of India would appoint. So the Delimitation Commission is appointed by the President of India, and it will have to work in association with, in tandem with the Election Commission of India. It has to work in tandem with the Election Commission of India. This is very important now. Very, very important. Now suppose Delimitation Commission has given out an order. They worked on something and they now have come out with an order. Okay, this is the way that we have delimited such constituencies. And they pass on an order. This order has the force of law. Has the force of law, and these are such forceful, or maybe if I say these are so powerful laws that they cannot be challenged in any court. They cannot be challenged. They cannot be challenged in the court. They cannot be challenged. They cannot be called in question or called to be questioned in any court. They cannot be called to question. So this is your Article 82. Article 82 that says that, Article 82 would say that the Parliament would enact a Delimitation Commission Act. The Parliament would enact a Delimitation Commission Act after every census. After every census. According to Article 82, it says that the Parliament by law would enact a Delimitation Act after every census. Now once this act would come, as soon as under Article 82 Delimitation Act is there, under this Delimitation Act we set up Delimitation Commission. This act will define, this act will give the powers, this act will call for what sort of nature of work this Delimitation Commission is going to do. The same if I say under Article 170, even the states would be getting their constituencies. So under Article 82, the Parliament would enact a law that let's set up a Delimitation Commission. This would be the scope of it, this is the nature of it, these are the powers. Like you might have heard of this statement, the terms of reference. It might have come to you in the form of an association of the Finance Commission. But these are the things that are defined in the Act first, and then a delimitation commission is made. This delimitation commission would define for the constituencies, and also Article 170 would say that states also get divided into their territorial constituencies by the delimitation commission. Okay. Now see one more thing. So one or two questions that are there is, who sets up? It is appointed by the President of India, that is correct. 82 would say that the Parliament by law would give a delimitation act under which a delimitation commission would be made. And then Article 170 would say that even the states would have their territorial constituencies being made under this delimitation act only, or the delimitation commission set up under the delimitation act. Now what happened is, why after every census, I think you all can understand, we will account for the population, the growth in population, and then we will try to fit in that where or what should be the size of constituency, what should be the shape of the constituency. After every census it will be done. But 2002 we had this 84th amendment, the 84th amendment, 2002 84th amendment, that said that the delimitation process and the population that it will take into account shall be frozen as it has already been taken off 1971, suppose 1971 census. So it says that let's fix this population and it will be frozen, the number of seats will be frozen till 2026. Till 2026 you cannot change the seats or number of seats in the Parliament. This has been frozen by the 84th Constitutional Amendment Act. So the question is, if they have frozen the seats, delimitation commission has lost the purpose or what? Now it will not have anything to do. Now here the thing is, I suppose my seat is fixed now, but what I can see is there are two suppose constituencies X, Y. This Y is having a great exponential population growth, and X we can see that the population is coming down. Although the seat is fixed, the number of seat is fixed, but when I was studying the constituencies, I found that there was a constituency which had exponential rate of growth of population, while this one had a dip down in population. It is the work of delimitation commission to allow for a uniform distribution of the votes throughout the constituency. That means that it will be tried in such a manner that X and Y has the same number of votes per constituency. There should be a uniformity in the votes. But what is happening is Y has increased exponentially in population, X has dipped down. So what they will try to do is, they will try to readjust the shape of the constituency. They will try to, earlier the shape, by shape I mean that the areas that should be included or excluded of that constituency. So they would feel that, okay, this subset, suppose Y1, Y2, these are the areas in this Y constituency. What they'll do is, no, since the population has increased so much, let's restrict it to only Y1 and Y2 and Y3. Let's remove this Y4 and add it to some other constituency Z, suppose. Or they could add this to X. So just to have that balance, this delimitation commission would come up and would try to see that is there uniformity still maintained or not. Although the seats are fixed, but we will have to see that this constituency is going in, or this area is going in which constituency. And you might have heard a lot of news about, no, that a candidate has even lost the election just because of this shuffle. Because some area suppose was concentrated, and that person who is contesting the election would feel that, okay, I have the support of these voters, but by the time the election would come and this commission has already reshuffled the things and this has gone into some other constituency, that person was fighting from this constituency, he would have less of votes. So you might have heard that even some great leaders would lose if this constitution reshuffling is done. So this is a delimitation commission. Article 82 you have to remember. Article 170. I suppose this is fine. Now there was a lot of news about this reservation of seats and particularly about the Anglo-Indians. About the Anglo-Indians, and I know you know about all these things. Just a recap of this Anglo-Indians. The first probable question they could ask you is there a definition of who is supposed to be Anglo-Indian given in the constitution or not? So for example, if they ask you, is this word Anglo-Indian defined in the constitution itself or not? So the first statement would be, is it defined or not? So the answer is yes. Under Article 366, under Article 366, it is defined that who is supposed to be or deemed to be an Anglo-Indian. So yes, the definition is there. It talks about that any of the male, or if suppose that person who had his father or the male progenitors in the male line, they have defined in this manner. Like suppose if I want to find out the identity, that is he an Anglo-Indian or not, the constitution would say find out the male progenitors, maybe father, grandfather. So in this line only try to find out if any of these were of European descent and they are living in the territory of the country or in the territory of India or in the country, and or if this person was born in the territory of India and is residing not for the temporary purposes, he is residing or she is residing, then he or she would be an Anglo-Indian. So we'll just have to see in the male line if they are from European descent and they have been residing in the territory, or this person was born, is residing in the territory and the people or the persons, the male progenitors were from the European descent, then this person is the Anglo-Indian. They would not ask you the definition, but the question is the definition given under Article 366 Clause 2. Under Article 366 Clause 2, it has been defined. 366 Clause 2. Also, since we have heavily taken our constitution from some historical evolution or underpinnings in which we have this 1935 Act playing a very dominant role, there could be a question here also that was this Anglo-Indian defined, or have we taken the definition, or are we inspired from the definition as it is given in 1935 Act? Yes. So 1935 Act would come up and would say that this is the definition of Anglo-Indian. 1935 Act defines the Anglo-Indian term was defined in the Government of India Act 1935. Got it? Now let's see. So once defined that okay, these are going to be the Anglo-Indians, how to include them, or is there a provision to include them in the law making process? So we have Article 331, in which it is said that the President can nominate two Anglo-Indians. The President can nominate two Anglo-Indians or can nominate two members of the Anglo-Indian community if no member of this community is elected in the Lok Sabha. He has that power to nominate two Anglo-Indian members, but this power, or he is not mandated to do this. He might feel that they are represented in some manner, it is fine. He is not mandated to do so. He has the power, but he is not mandated to do so. Do remember this, he is not mandated to do this. Then you also have this Article 333. Article 333, since the President will have for the Lok Sabha, even the Governor can have this power to nominate one member. Here it was 2, here it is 1. Here it was 1. Can nominate one member in the Legislative Assembly. But what happened is, the 104th Constitutional Amendment Act came. Article 331 said, Article 333 said that if they so feel that they are not represented properly, they could nominate, President could nominate 2 into the Lok Sabha and Governor can do 1 nomination in the Legislative Assembly. But 104th Constitutional Amendment Act came and it said that, or it has done away with the provision of this reservation of seats for Anglo-Indians. So for Anglo-Indians, now there is no such provision for the reservation. It has removed the reserved seats for the Anglo-Indian community in the Lok Sabha. Now see the question, 104th Constitutional Amendment Act, very important. What it has done? Removed the provision for the reservation of the seats for the Anglo-Indians in the Lok Sabha. Question is, only in the Lok Sabha or Assembly also? It is both. In the Lok Sabha plus the assemblies. So it could be a trap here. It is for both Lok Sabha and the assemblies. So it has done away with the reservation of Anglo-Indians in the Lok Sabha and the assemblies. 104th Constitutional Amendment Act. Do remember this, 104th. Now since we have come to this 104th Constitutional Amendment Act, a very easy question could be, just remember it this way, this is about the Anglo-Indian and it has been removed. Although 104th Constitutional Amendment Act also had reflection on the reservation of the seats for scheduled caste and scheduled tribe, but it has extended that period to another 10 years. So it is not only for the Anglo-Indians, this is actually different thing that has come up or a new thing that has come up. They have done away with this Anglo-Indian community reservation of seats in the Assembly and the Lok Sabha, but the scheduled caste and scheduled type reservation that is there is to be continued and it has been extended to another 10 years. So 104th Constitutional Amendment, Anglo-Indians plus SC/ST reservation in the legislature, this has been done away with. Then I am sure you know about the 103rd Constitutional Amendment Act. This you should know about EWS. Just a recap, maybe a direct question can come. Then you have this 102nd Constitutional Amendment Act. So what they can ask you is a very sort of easy question they could ask you is, they directly try to match the pairs, or this amendment they would give you and they would say that which of the statements are right. So 103 you could confuse with you of the maybe Anglo-Indian one, or 102nd with the EWS one. So 102nd is for your constitutional status for the National Commission for the Backward Classes. National Commission for the Backward Classes, constitutional status given by 102 or 102nd Constitutional Amendment. Then you very well know about this 101st Constitutional Amendment Act. Beautiful structure of the taxation would come in, that would be GST, and we will never be going to, or we are never able to understand what has just happened by 101st Amendment Act. It's so much for us to remember this, but we can only understand one thing, that okay, our indirect tax structure has changed via this. You also remember this 100th one, the land boundary agreement or the exchange of the enclaves between India and Bangladesh. India and Bangladesh. So 100th Constitutional Amendment Act. So the exchange of certain of the territories or the enclaves between these two countries, 100th Constitutional Amendment Act, very important for this year. Maybe they could directly ask a question on this, Okay. So see, the question is, the Anglo-Indian Community Reservation has been done away with. President has the power to nominate was under Article 331. Governor has the power to appoint or nominate under Article 333. Now there is an Article 334. This was the article that talks about the reservation of seats in the legislature. Now you might have written a question on this or written an answer on this. The question could be that what all are the provisions in the Constitution that provide for the protection, for the promotion, or maybe the vulnerable section of the people, how this Constitution is giving them the protection, the security, what provisions are in this Constitution. So you have almost written many times about Article 334, which talks about that the reservation of the seats and the special representation would cease to exist after 40 years. Now the words are this: after 40 years, there are certain reservations and certain special seats that are being reserved. This would be done away with after 40 years. But this, under this only the clauses are there. So the clause 2 would say that for SC and ST you can reserve it. But then there was a third clause that said that for the Anglo-Indians you can reserve the seats. This was the amendment that was done. 104th Constitutional Amendment Act would say that this should be now removed. This ceases to exist now. So under Article 334 we talk about the reservation of seats for SC, ST and the Anglo-Indians. This has been, the SC, ST has been continued, extended, but the Anglo-Indian one has said, or this amendment says that this is ceased to exist now. This do not exist now. I hope you got the point. 331, 333 talks about the power of the president and the governor. But that power would have been exercised according to this 334, because 334 would say that the seats would be reserved for Anglo-Indians, the seats would be reserved for SC and ST, and to some quantum of time was given. SC, ST it has been increased or extended to another 10 years. For Anglo-Indians it has been ceased to exist, or it has been said that okay, now let's they are already now represented and there are people, so let's stop this reservation. Now this also brings me to a debate that was going on. Now this judiciary and the right to information, these were so much in tussle. Every judicial pronouncement would say that every other body that is in front of us, or every other body except us, is under the ambit of RTI. There was such judicial pronouncements that would say that every person that, or every office or every institution that has some money that is to do something with the government is under the RTI. Every judicial pronouncement would say so. But for the judiciary themselves, they said, no, we are not into the RTI, we cannot give you the details. But then a very recent judgment came and it said that we are not aloof, we are not isolated, we are not apart from this RTI, we are part, or we are under this ambit of RTI. Although with some conditions. So the Supreme Court and the RTI, it said that Supreme Court and the CJI, so a very well worded judgment came out. It said that CJI is not different from Supreme Court. When I say CJI, the Chief Justice of India, that is to refer to Supreme Court. And when we say Supreme Court, that means the constituents of it, that means the CJI and the other judges. So Supreme Court and the CJI would be under the definition of public authority as is mentioned in the RTI Act. So yes, they are also under the ambit of RTI. It is a public authority under the section 2H of the Act. This you don't have to remember, I am just telling you. So yes, Supreme Court has CJI. So direct question can come. Who all is under the ambit of RTI? Till previous years, they were not agreeing to it. They were saying that no, we are not under it. We need our independence, we need our integrity, we cannot be under any such act. We are actually doing a lot for ourselves. We had made commissions for the accountability. You might have read this. National, like this judicial accountability bill was there, and they say that we have this accountability, we have a system of commission in us, in the institution itself, and we duly report our all money or all properties or everything. But then this judgment came and it said that no, we are also under it, so you can ask us questions. And it also said that if there is a serving judge, what is the harm in giving out the asset details that this judge carries? So it said that even the judge's assets, whatever properties, money, whatever things are there in his possession can be revealed out by the RTI. So disclosure of details of serving judges' personal assets can be given. So they said that earlier what they said is, no, we cannot give out you the asset details because it is a breach to right to my privacy. They said that earlier they used to say that I will not give you details, it is my privacy, it is my ambit, why should I give you? But now after this judgment it is said that it is not a violation, of right to privacy, it is not a violation of right to privacy. It is not a violation of right to privacy. Was not a violation. But they said one more point. They said that the right to know is not an absolute right. The right to know is not an absolute right. That means that you cannot ask us everything or anything that comes to your mind. So there is a protection that must be there, there is a condition that must be there, that if you have some wrong things in your mind, that you take out our details and you want to affect something, or you want to harm the integrity, or you want to have that maybe a sort of insult that you can do, or propaganda that you can do, we cannot allow you to do that. So it's not an absolute right. It's not an absolute right. This is not an absolute right. So right to know is good, but right to know under the RTI is with some restrictions and conditions, and it is not an absolute right. It's not an absolute right. So if there are questions that would cause unwarranted invasion into someone's privacy, that is not required for, this cannot be given out, or the information cannot be given out. So this is very clear, they have talked about this, it's not an absolute right. So what they say is, I will not give out my information if it is frivolous, or if it is only for some unhindered or maybe sort of thing that you want to want us to know, or there is a propaganda behind it, we won't give you the details. So what would happen is, now there would be an appellate authority that would be set up. Only when the appellate authority would feel that the conscience of this person who wants the answers to be given is fine, then only we will give our details, else we will not give. So it is to ascertain by the appellate authority that his conscience is clear and he want to have just a report for some purpose that will do good, that will be for some beneficial activities, I'll give the details and everything. But unless and until it is for, or maybe if it is for frivolous things, we will not give it. This was very clear. Then also it was cleared. So people would ask about, sir, is this collegium system that you do, the appointment of judges that you do, is it also under this RTI? You have talked about your assets, you have talked about that the post of CJI or the office of CJI is under RTI. So please also let us know, is this collegium process also under this right to information? I want to understand. So the judgment said that there is a difference between input and the output. While this collegium system is here, this collegium system is here, that will be feeding the names, the information that is required, and they would be sending the list of the judges as per their decision, their discretion, their consensus, their discussions. They would send this list to the government or to the executive. This is the input part where we are deliberating, we are thinking, we are giving a list. This is the input part because we are giving this input to the executive. This is not under the ambit of RTI. This input part is not under the ambit of RTI, but yes, the final outcome, the output of it, what has happened finally is surely under RTI. So what happens finally is under RTI. But till the time we were having this discussion, we were having this deliberation going on, it is an input thing and we don't want these details to come out. So finally this is settled then that they would say that okay, this is again, this curtain is there, whatever we decide is under a curtain, but whatever the result is anyway we are getting to know. So this was very clearly spelled out that this is input and output. Input we cannot know, output you will know any time or as soon as the names are there in the list, you will know about this. So input and output. The only thing is, if they ask you, is the collegium system under, or if they in this decision it was given, the collegium system has come under the ambit of RTI, it has not come because only the final outcome that we can understand, it has not come. CJI, Supreme Court, is under the public authority definition that is given. Every detail has to be given out. So not every detail. It is only when it is not for the frivolous activities, then only will give it, else will not give it. So a question can come on this also, RTI and the Supreme Court. Now you might have read this article. Yesterday we had this discussion about Article 131. And yes, I must also say that this discussion, okay, we'll come to that discussion also, but for the time being, Article 130. Article 130. What does it talk about? 130 says that it talks about the regional benches. And who has the power? Who has the power? Article 130. It talks about, it is the CJI that acts as person designata, or he is the person authorized to call for where this regional bench would sit. And it is said that the Supreme Court can sit at any other place other than Delhi. So under Article 130 it is said the Supreme Court may sit at a place other than Delhi on the order of this person designata, who is no one but this CJI. But this person designator CJI, when he orders to sit anywhere else other than Delhi, he will have to take prior approval of the President of India. So the prior approval of the President of India is needed for this. With the prior approval of the President of India, person designata, that is the Chief Justice of India, under Article 130 can allow for the Supreme Court to move to any other place out of Delhi. Now the other question is this President approval necessary? Is this President approval necessary? Yes. President approval is necessary. President approval is necessary. Second statement, there is a requirement of constitutional amendment for setting up of regional benches. If this is the statement in front of you, that a constitutional amendment is required for the setting up of the benches or regional benches of the Supreme Court, please be very clear. No constitutional amendment is required. No constitutional amendment would be required. in order to go for the regional benches, no constitutional amendment would be required, but the president approval is necessary. The president approval is necessary. So be very clear here. Now, yesterday I had a request coming in that we have discussed 131. Can we also talk about Article 136? Article 142 we have also discussed, and you can see previous year papers, it has been asked in different forms. So when it comes to Supreme Court or pronouncing any such judicial order or judicial pronouncements, please understand, unless and until some clause is given which is restricting it, Supreme Court would always be above the parliamentary law or the parliament hold on it. It will always be above, and it will do anything to do or to bring about that person or entity to justice. 142 complete justice. Even this Article 136, it calls for SLP, the special leave petitions. The special leave petitions. So it said that under Article 136 that against any order by the courts or the tribunals, against any orders by the courts or any such tribunal, a special leave can be granted if the Supreme Court so feels that the case warrants that. That means we will have to submit an application against a judgment of a tribunal or other courts, and we will submit it to the Supreme Court that please see, we need a special leave from you. There is a problem, they have given a final decision, but we want you to see this. The Supreme Court would say that yes, we can give you a special leave, or we might not give you a special leave. That means that once you approach, it is not your right now to avail that. It is their decision. If they want to give you special leave, you can avail it. If they will say that your application is rejected, you have not got that special leave, or you will not be in the possession of special leave. This makes it different from the article that you might have read so many times. 32. Here it is that Supreme Court cannot deny once you reach that, please I want to invoke this writ, or this is my writ petition, maybe of mandamus, habeas corpus, anything that you want to take up, all the writs that are mentioned, you will have to be given. But here special leave, the word is special leave. Special leave means we are giving you a chance because we feel that okay, this is a special petition that has come, or we might not give you a chance, or we might not give you a chance. So this is about any order from any court or tribunal. Now the second clause of Article 136 would say or restrict that if that court or if that order, so 136 would again say that, this is clause 2 that would say that this special leave would not be applicable to any judgment, any order that has been given by or that has relation with armed forces. That means if the armed forces has set up a tribunal, or this tribunal now says that, or under any law this tribunal has been set up and this tribunal pronounced a judgment, special leave cannot be taken on these matters. Special leave cannot be taken. So this clause of 136(1) that says that for any court, any tribunal, any decree, any order that has been given, we can give you a special leave as an appellate, as an appeal. But if this tribunal is in the form or is in relation with an armed forces set up under the armed forces law, then we are so sorry, we cannot give it. This will not apply in any judgment or sentence or any tribunal which is under the influence of armed forces or has been set up for the purpose of armed forces. 136 cannot be applied. Special leave petition cannot be applied. This could be a direct question. This could be a direct question. Now coming to a very important discussion. there were certain news items that came in that talked about that this particular state and the particular tribe of this state would be added to the scheduled tribe. So the tribes and the notification of it, and the notification of it, the tribes and the notification of it. Now just understand few things. This was in news for many. Karnataka, I could remember. In Karnataka, there was a demand for adding Siddhis, Paravara, so adding them to the list of the scheduled tribes. There were certain demands coming up, and then it happened. Now please understand, we have talked about the Anglo-Indians that are defined. Anglo-Indians that are defined under the Constitution. Now if I say Article 366 talks about Anglo-Indians, also talks about scheduled caste and scheduled tribe also. The clause is in it. So yes, Anglo-Indian is defined in the Constitution. My question or a PT trap here is, or PT alert here is the definition of what is a scheduled tribe or what is a scheduled caste, is it given in the Constitution or not? Or has there been some process, or is there some prerequisite parameters that to see what constitute or what tribe might be called as scheduled tribe, even just looking at these parameters, are they codified, or is there a definition of what constitutes the scheduled tribe or scheduled caste, is it given somewhere? So just understand, it is not given in the Constitution. It is not given in the Constitution. Article 366 is important. 366 says that scheduled tribes are as deemed, or these are defined. The word defined does not mean that they have given a definition. They say that scheduled tribe would be such entities that are mentioned, that are deemed, or that are mentioned under Article 342 when I talk about scheduled tribe. So this Article 366 says that for the purpose of this definition, we will have to refer to another article, that is Article 342. And under Article 342, whosoever or whichever entity or tribe is defined or is finalized as scheduled tribe, that will be taken up here. So Article 366 only says that it has defined the scheduled tribes as those deemed under Article 342. So what happened is, Article 342. In Article 342, they have not given a definition. So they have not given a definition. This is true. There is no such constitutional definition. But under Article 342, what they have done is, they have given the powers to some post, or they have given a sort of procedure of how these tribes can be notified as scheduled tribe, or how any such group, any such sort of a community, any such subgroup can be called as a scheduled tribe or scheduled caste. There is a process that is given. So 342 would say that it is, please pay attention here now, it defines the procedure or the process, and under that process and procedure it is the president, that by an order would give a notification, by an order, the president by a notification or by an order would try to define or would try to tell that which, or would try to specify that this is the tribe that must be added to the scheduled tribe list. So this is the president. This is notified any such tribe. Suppose this tribe X still not in the list, but the president, if so feels, after consultation with the governor, can give a order or notification that this can be designated or deemed as scheduled tribe. So the initiation of the step, the first step would always be the presidential order. Now the question is, can this order be modified or not? This order can be modified by an act of parliament. The order that is given by the president can be modified subsequently only with act of parliament. So please understand, president would take the situation as it is and would consult with the governor and would say that okay, this particular tribe can be now notified into the list of scheduled tribe. Now this order as it has come, now this would be, this order as it comes, I think it's audible. So this order as it comes would be notified only by an act of parliament. This you have to remember, by an act of parliament. That means subsequently, if you want to include or exclude, if anything is to be included or excluded, this is done by the order or this act of parliament. This is done by the act of parliament. Now suppose after 150 years, suppose, just an assumption, there is a entity or there is a tribe that is suppose X, and again this, suppose there are now demands that okay, now we want to come out of this. So what would happen is, again this can be done by the act of parliament. So any such modification to the order can be done by the act of parliament. Third question they could ask you or they would put you through is, the constitution mentions the criterion or the criterias or the parameters that would define for who shall be constituted or who shall be deemed as scheduled tribe. Please be very clear, there is no such parameter, there is no such parameter. There are no such parameters or there is no such parameter. It is not mentioned in the constitution. It is not mentioned in the constitution. So under Article 366, when it comes to who is it, we have the definition of Anglo-Indians being given, but it is not given for scheduled tribe and the scheduled caste. It is merely written that you refer to Article 342 for the purpose of scheduled tribe and refer to Article 341 for the purpose of scheduled caste. And what is given there, that it is the president that will take the reference or consultation with the governor and would give an order. This order can be subsequently modified by the act of parliament. So you can try to think, a question might be probable this year on this whole topic of inclusion and exclusion from the list, or who has the power. Is it defined or not? Who has the power to modify the order? Is the criteria mentioned or not? These questions can come. And then you might be knowing this, but just a small discussion. Article 29 and 30. You might have read also. So there is a difference between Article 29 and Article 30. So a question can be set up in between the difference of Article 29 and 30, where it is said that, now please understand, Article 29 says that all minorities, whether based on, just a second, this is Article 29 and this is Article 30. Now the difference is, Article 30, if I talk about, let's talk about Article 29 first. Article 29 would say that the difference is that any section of citizens, see the wording, Article 29 says that section of citizens residing in any part. So the first step was here, any section of citizens. which have a distinct language, a distinct script, and they want to preserve it. So this section of citizens could also mean minority, or it could also mean a section of majority. Here is the difference. Article 29 says that any section of citizens, that means minority as well as majority. While Article 30, it does not say section of citizens. It is only all minorities. It starts with all minorities. So only minorities. Only minorities. While 29 says section of citizens, the right of all the section of citizens to preserve scripts or culture or custom or language, but for 30 it is only minorities. Only minorities. Now here again the question could be there, is it only religious or it can be linguistic minorities also? So the answer here is they can be both, either religious or linguistic. This is the difference. 29 would talk about the sections of citizens and 30 would talk about all the minorities, all the minorities. So this does not extend to a section of citizens but minorities. Now you might also remember we did 25, 26, 27 and there is a difference between now the word. While you see here 29 and 30, they would talk about citizens. The word is citizens. While you go to 25, it will talk about people, all people. That means this is for the citizens of the country and that is for maybe citizens and non-citizens. Now my question to you is, a very direct question it can come, what other articles are there that have been given or that are only or that are listed only for the citizens? What other articles are there that are only listed for the citizens? You have to answer me this. What are listed only for the citizens? You have to answer me this. Now again a discussion on this is very important. Lapsing of bills. Our Honorable Vice President was actually worrying about this, that lapsing of the bills or how can we protect them, the quantum of it, the working hours, the efficiencies of the parliament, all was being discussed. And lapsing of bill was sometime in news for another, maybe if I go back to 7-8 months, it was in news. Maybe they could ask you, not who said what, but they could ask you a statement, maybe 3-4 statements they could give you, a statement based question could be asked and they would ask you which is liable to lapse, which bill will lapse, which will not. So they could be asking you many questions on this and you know about Article 105, you know about Article 110 and you might also know about Article 107. So 105 you know about, the privileges. 110 you can talk about, the money bill, I suppose you all know about this. 107. Now this defines the process or the procedure of the introduction and the passing of the bills and also lapsing of the bills. 107 talks about introduction and the passing of the bills and the cases where the bills would lapse. 107. So I have just devised one method for this, that is, suppose this is my Lok Sabha, this is my Rajya Sabha. I just have devised one method, touch and fall, touch and lapse or touch and fall. And we can see this in the cases, touch and lapse or touch and fall. That means a bill originated here, in the Lok Sabha. A bill originated here in the Lok Sabha, but pending here only. So we are talking about the lapsing of the bills during the dissolution of Lok Sabha, how the bills would lapse or which bills would survive. We are talking about this, and this is all mentioned in 107. So if a bill is originating here in the Lok Sabha and is pending here itself, touch and fall. So when we talk about the dissolution, dissolution will not happen of the Rajya Sabha. Rajya Sabha is a permanent house, dissolution happens here. Touch and fall. You touch the dissolved house and you fall. You touch, the bill touches the dissolved house and it will lapse. So it is originating here. What about touch? It is originating here and it is pending. It has already touched. It is here itself. It will lapse. So please write down this very clearly and correctly, and please fit this into your mind. A very basic and easy question can come. Bill originating here and pending here will lapse. Now suppose bill originated here. A bill originated here in the Rajya Sabha. Rajya Sabha took all the pain and passed it here to Lok Sabha. Touch. Originated here, passed it to the Lok Sabha. Now what will happen? If it is pending in the Lok Sabha, suppose, lapse. A bill originated here, passed from here to Lok Sabha, is pending here, lapsed. Now see, a bill originated here. A bill originated here, passed to Rajya Sabha. It has originated here and is passed to Rajya Sabha. Since it has touched this dissolved house, it will also lapse. It will also lapse. A bill originated and passed by the Lok Sabha and is there in the Rajya Sabha or is pending in the Rajya Sabha, it will lapse. So what, now see, another case could be, suppose a bill originated in Rajya Sabha and passed to Lok Sabha. A bill originated in the Rajya Sabha and passed to Lok Sabha. Lok Sabha says, no, we want some amendments to be done into this bill. We again are transferring this to you. So suppose this transferring or some proposed amendments are being done and is being sent to the Rajya Sabha again and is pending in the Rajya Sabha. Since it has touched this house, it is liable to be lapsed. It will lapse. I suppose you are clear with this formula, touch and lapse. You touch this house and you will fall. Once dissolved, it will fall. But where it will not fall? Where it will not fall? Now see, Lok Sabha, Rajya Sabha, where the bills will not lapse. A bill pending in Rajya Sabha. There is a bill that is pending here, not passed by the Lok Sabha. A bill that is pending here but not passed by the Lok Sabha. It has not an encounter with the Lok Sabha. It will not lapse. It will not lapse. A bill pending in the Rajya Sabha but not passed by the Lok Sabha. But not passed by the Lok Sabha will not lapse. Or a bill passed by both the houses. A bill passed by both the houses but waiting for the assent to be given by the President. They have done their job, they have sent it for the presidential assent. This bill that has been passed but waiting for the presidential assent will not lapse. A bill passed by both the houses or pending assent of the President will not lapse. Now what happened is, suppose the President, this Lok Sabha was working, it was not dissolved, but the President has notified there is some disagreement that is going on between the two houses, and they say that let's have a joint sitting, to bring about a consensus. Let's have a joint sitting. So suppose if the President has notified for holding the joint session before the dissolution, after the dissolution it won't do this. before the dissolution of the Lok Sabha, the President says that we want to have a joint sitting, we should have a joint sitting. If it has notified for a joint sitting over a bill, then that bill will not lapse. Then this bill will not lapse. Now suppose this bill that was passed by and the presidential assent was being waited, this will not lapse. But suppose the President can also send it again to the houses that please reconsider it. In that case also, in which the President has returned a bill passed by both the houses but has been returned by the President for reconsideration, will not lapse. So that means the touch and lapse formula will not work once the President is trying to cover or protect. If the President says that there should be a joint sitting and after 10 days of this notification the Lok Sabha is dissolved, that still means that the bill is surviving. The bill will not lapse. Also, if the presidential assent is being waited upon, the bill will not lapse because there is a protection given by President. Now this is my term of protection. Please understand it. This is a manner in which I am telling you. It's not thought in that way, but what I am saying is touch and lapse policy will not work when the President or once the President sets in. Or this bill might have not even seen the face of Lok Sabha. It is there in Rajya Sabha, pending there, not being passed by Lok Sabha, pending there in Rajya Sabha. It will not lapse. It has not seen the face, it has not touched Lok Sabha, it will not lapse. I suppose this is clear. I suppose this is clear to all of you. So touch and lapse would work in the dissolution or will work when the bills are going to lapse under the dissolution of Lok Sabha. But if the bill does not touch it, it will not lapse. Or it should be given some extra power from somewhere, for example, President, assent is being waited or it has been sent for reconsideration or a joint sitting was being planned or has been notified before the dissolution of Lok Sabha, it will not lapse. It will not lapse. And I am sure now you can answer the question if it comes in front of you. Every year, almost every year or every alternate year, there is a question on preamble. Now when I say this, I want you to understand, I want you to actually explore what the preamble has to say. A direct question can come from the words of it, but the words that are written should not be taken in a narrow-minded manner. Take the broadest view which you can take. Now, for example, if I ask you the preamble, the first question is it a part, this you all must know, is it a part of the Constitution? Direct question, yes. Which case? Keshwanand Bharti case. Keshwanand Bharti case would say it is a part of the Constitution. You might also be in possession of this information of Berubari Union case. Please, if you have read it, fine, do let me know what it talked about. Does that case talk about this to be part of the Constitution or otherwise? You let me know. But the Keshwanand Bharti case settled the fact that this is a part of the Constitution. This is a part of the Constitution. That also means that preamble can be amended. This also means that preamble can be amended. So can amendment of the preamble be done? Yes, it can be amended. Can be amended. That also means that we have now to understand the amendment process as it is, and this we have to relate with the judgment that has come in Keshwanand Bharti case and that we have discussed the basic structure. Preamble can be amended, but you cannot amend the basic principles of the preamble, the basic light of the preamble, what it has to speak about. You insert a word, fine, no problem. But that word inserted should only glorify it, should make it more beautiful. But you try to curtail a word which is going to impact the basic structure, the basic learning, the basic light of the preamble, that we cannot allow. So amendment can be done. I hope you got this point. Okay. They have asked this question in many forms. Can this preamble a power or a tool of making or giving any body power, or is it a tool for restriction? That means if I want to ask you that preamble is the supreme power, or is the power to source, or is the power to restrict or prohibit, does it has that influence power to restrict or prohibit, or not influence power could be very subjective. Does it has that supreme power to restrict or prohibit, or is it a source of any restriction? That means that suppose if something is done wrong, can this preamble be taken and can this make anybody powerful that you stop that violation that is being done? So it is not a source of restriction or a source of power. It is not a source of prohibition. So be very clear here, it does not empower. But what it can do is, question has come last year, that it has empowering powers, or it has that power to give a force to any such law. Not at all. It does not have that power. It is merely indicative, but it is a light for interpreting what the constitution articles has to say, what the constitutional principle will talk about. So it is the light, you can talk about that, yes, it is, or it helps in interpretation. It helps in interpretation. But if a question comes that it has the force of law, it can be, or it can give force to any body, any entity to restrict, or as a source of power, not at all. It does not empower. It only allows for interpretation that can be made. You see this preamble. So what can be done is, I was reading an article, then I want to find out why this article is there, what does it mean. I read the preamble and then I think, okay, this is the interpretation that we can make out. Only this can be done. So this helps in interpretation, but it cannot be the supreme power or supreme source for restriction or prohibition. Now please see, a question has come. This is an analogy that I have made. This question has come and can come once again. You have got a question in 1 year that talked about liberty. So liberty, according to our constitution and preamble, does not mean that you have everything at your disposal and you can do any action. That is not the liberty that we have envisaged or that we have seen. Liberty is, you can do, you try to grow according to your potential, but under some regulated conditions, but under some conditions that you do not breach into someone other's right. Now this breach part would only come when you set something by law. That means liberty would not mean anything, or liberty can do harms if not regulated by law. Liberty can do harms if not regulated by law. So what I have made an analogy is, what liberty is to law, constitution is to sovereignty. What liberty is to law, constitution is to sovereignty. I hope you got the point. What I just meant to say is, liberty can do harms if not regulated by a law. So what liberty is to law, so for that good amount of liberty as that we have envisaged, it should have some control by law. Without law, liberty cannot exist. Without law, understood in this manner, that without law, liberty cannot exist. Without sovereignty, constitution cannot be there. Without law, liberty cannot exist. Without sovereignty, constitution cannot exist. A question can come, please interpret it in the broadest sense. Why law is required for liberty? Because if every one of us would imagine that liberty or would do anything according to our whims and fancies, that is not the liberty, because you might enjoy that liberty, but others are being harmed of it and those are not enjoying the liberty. So, law will have to be there for liberty and sovereignty is to be there for constitution. I hope you got this point. Law is to be there for liberty because liberty is to be enjoyed by everyone. So, law has to be there to restrict someone so that he should not breach into some other's liberty. In the same fashion, sovereignty is to be there for constitution. If you are not sovereign, if you are not governing yourself, you cannot have a constitution. This constitution is the proof that we are a sovereign country because we are driven by this law of the land. I hope you got the point. Sovereignty is required, a prerequisite for you to have your constitution. You just remove this sovereignty, this constitution will not exist. We, the people of India, sovereignty. You have decided what you want to give yourself. We are not guided by some other country or some other conventions. It is sovereignty and constitution. Now, this is my research that or hint that I am giving you. I want you to give me this relation. A question can come, very easy, just understand it the broadest manner. Please tell me what you can talk about equality, what you can talk about justice, and what you can talk about fraternity. This you have to tell me, that what you can understand when we say the fraternity or justice or equality, why it is needed, why justice and why fraternity. This you have to tell me. This you have to tell me. And I suppose you all can do this research. Now, a question also came, and that is very easy one that came. 9th schedule, very easy question. Even this question, 50% people have attempted this wrong, and this was the easiest question of the paper. The only question was, 9th schedule was inserted during the tenure of which prime minister? Now, if we understand this thing, 9th schedule was added. 9th schedule was added by the first Constitutional Amendment Act. Who would be there? The easiest question that we could find. This was comparable to a question that has come, that which body is replacing Planning Commission. It could be compared to this question. 9th schedule added by the first Constitutional Amendment Act. What was happening is, since all these debates were going on, that how to bring out a balance between the fundamental rights and the DPSPs, whatever laws that were brought about, they were, or the parliament or even the state assemblies, they were trying to shed it from the power of judiciary. Because anyone can go to the judiciary and would ask that, okay, this act has come and this is trying to harm my rights, you please nullify that act. This was going on, very rampant. People were so worried about this, and then they thought, let's make a small space in our constitution in which it is so dark that even the judiciary cannot penetrate. Make it in such a manner that it should be maybe in a blanket or in a curtain, in a wall, that even the judicial power cannot breach it. This started first Constitutional Amendment Act, 9th schedule added. While the first amendment would be adding only around 8 odd laws, but today we have more than 250 laws in it, and they think that they are protecting it. Now please understand, what will happen in this ninth schedule is, there are articles 31A and 31B. 31A and 31B. What is happening to protect for the land laws, the zamindari laws, the agrarian reforms that was being brought about? These two articles will be invoked and a schedule was made, that is the ninth schedule. While article 31A would say that I am going to protect some classes of laws, Here the classes of laws could be, okay, I would look for all the agrarian reform laws. I would look for the land laws. So this was for some classes of laws, while article 31A would say that I'll extend my protection to some classes of the laws. This said that, okay, you protect some classes, I will be open to some specific laws and enactments as they come. So any such law that was to be protected from the power of judiciary, they would put it under ninth schedule, which was invoked by 31A and 31B. 31A and 31B. Now, see one more thing. This 31B is so fascinating that it gives a retrospective effect in the manner that, suppose if any law that has been termed unconstitutional, and if it is placed under 31B, it is said that it will give a retrospective effect and it will even nullify the unconstitutionality pronouncement that is done by the judiciary. So under 31B, it is said that it has a retrospective effect. If the laws are inserted in the ninth schedule even after they are decided or they are being ordered as unconstitutional, they are considered to have been in the schedule. And they have been protected. So even after they have been nullified, and if it is inserted in the ninth schedule, according to article 31B, it means that it has been there in existence retrospectively and hence not nullified. Why not nullified? Because judiciary cannot, or judicial review cannot be done of the acts which is there in the ninth schedule. And hence, since it is retrospectively taken, that means either you define it today unconstitutional and 10 days after I add it into this schedule, ninth schedule, then article 31B says that since it has been added, it has a retrospective effect. That means that even when you were pronouncing it unconstitutional, it was existing even before that. It was retrospectively existing and hence not nullified. Why not nullified? Because you cannot check it, you cannot put a clout on it, you cannot term it unconstitutional because it has existed even before your order. I hope this gets clear. So it has a retrospective effect, that even if the laws are inserted after they are termed unconstitutional, they would not remain so, because under the assumption that they have retrospective effect, and that means the judicial pronouncement could have come today, but this law was inserted and it has been given retrospective effect. That means it is there since its existence and you do not have the power to term it unconstitutional. And the court does not have the power to term it unconstitutional, 31B, retrospective effect. But 31B says that judicial review cannot be done, but the present situation is that anything and everything that judiciary wants to review, in whatever part of the constitution you place it, they will do the review. It is open to judicial review. This is the present situation. Whether you keep it here or anywhere, it is an open condition now. It shall be open to the scrutiny to the scrutiny of the Supreme Court if any such law is violating the fundamental rights. If any such law is violating the fundamental rights. I hope this is clear. So any such law that is existing, even the article says that no, you cannot enter, you cannot see, but if it is hampering fundamental rights or the basic structure is a good word. If it is hampering the basic structure, it will be open to review or the scrutiny. It will be open for review. Now there was a news that was going on. The State Election Commission. The State Election Commission. The State Election Commission. The State Election Commission. So what was happening? Since there was no such guidelines, state election commissioners or the people who were appointed as a state election commissioner, they were probably the bureaucrats, and a judgment then came that said that why are you appointing bureaucrats on these positions? The State Election Commission must be consisting of the person who does not have to play any role or should have been neutral, should have not been a part of bureaucracy. This was the judgment that came, and hence they would not ask you the judgment, but they are going to ask you the State Election Commission. The State Election Commission, now let's see. And I am sure you have few things with you. Is it a constitutional body? Yes. The Constitution of India. The Constitution of India has given the power to organize, to direct, to superintendent the elections of the rural bodies, or maybe the conduct of elections of the panchayats and the municipalities. Be very clear here, people get confused. State Election Commission is for the mere purpose of conducting the elections of the local bodies, be it the panchayats or the municipalities. And yes, it has been given the power of the Constitution of India vests the power in the State Election Commission. Now see, the State Election Commissioner is appointed by Governor. The State Election Commissioner is appointed by the Governor. And if a question is asked now, suppose the State Election Commissioner is appointed by the Governor, if they ask you now is, the State Election Commission works, if they give you a statement, suppose that the State Election Commission works independently or independently works independent of the Election Commission of India. Suppose if they give you this, that the State Election Commission works independent or independently of the Election Commission of India, what should be your answer? Yes, the ambit is different. Election Commission of India to the Parliament, legislature, state. But the State Election Commission has been given the power, or it has been vested with powers, clothed with powers to talk about the superintendence, the electoral process, the electoral rolls for that matter, everything that is to be dealt with for the election of panchayats and the municipalities. So be very clear, it is working independently of Election Commission of India. It is working independently of the Election Commission of India. This State Election Commissioner, the State Election Commissioner has the status, salary, privileges, allowances of Judge of High Court, So So has the status, salary, allowances of a judge of High Court, and he cannot be removed after the appointment. He cannot be removed unless until the same process is followed that happens in the removal of the judge of a High Court. He can be removed, but in the same manner, on the like and the grounds of the judge of High Court. Judge of High Court. So he has been equated with the judge of High Court. Now please see, I want to bring this discussion, very important, Article 324, you remember, the Constitution of India would give the power to Election Commission of India, versus, if I say, 243K. 324 versus 243K. So for all the elections, superintendent's direction for the elections of the parliament or the state, Article 324 talks about or speaks about. While 243K talks about the elections at the ground level or the elections of local government, and the same words are there, superintendent's direction that is to be given for the elections of the panchayats and the municipalities. Okay, this is given. 324 says, it says that the commission or the Election Commission of India must consist of Chief Election Commissioner, must consist of a Chief Election Commissioner and such other members. Article 324 says that the Election Commission shall consist of the Chief Election Commissioner and such other members, who would be termed as the election commissioners if there as the president from time to time. So Article 324 says that there should be a Chief Election Commissioner and such other members as or called as the election commissions or election commissioners, as the president may from time to time fix. So the power to fix this has been given to the president. Who shall be the members of the Election Commission of India apart from the CEC? Such other members as the president may from time to time fix. So this is the power given to the president. But what has happened in 243K? What has happened in 243K? 243K says that it does not talk about a body that there would be a Chief State Election Commissioner. It merely says that there is to be an electoral process or the direction superintendence of the election to be conducted at the panchayats and municipalities shall be done by State Election Commissioner, who would be appointed by Governor. This is the difference between 243K and 324. I hope you got this point. 243K and 324. That their governor is only written that a state election commissioner would be appointed by the governor, but here it is written that such other members as the president from time to time may fix, and also it is written that it is subjected to the parliament or the laws made by the parliament. But this word is written that CEC and such other members, and once there are other members that are coming into the Election Commission of India, then there would be a chief election commissioner and other election commissioners. And I am sure you know about that. If suppose it is now a 3 or 4 member body, suppose 3 member body, who or what would be the maybe matter or the format of whose order is going to prevail, or does the CEC has that overarching power over the other election commissioners? What is the procedure? I am sure you know about this, let me know. That will this Chief Election Commissioner have most of the power concentrated in him, or will there be a consensus that would be arrived? Do let me know. So this is the only difference that I wanted to tell you. If a question comes on state election commissioner or commission, it is written that there shall be a state election commissioner and appointed by governor. The salary, allowances and the status would be equated with the High Court judge. The removal process is the High Court judge. So be very clear, and they confuse you with small words, no. Constitutional body, yes, mentioned in the Constitution 243K. And they would confuse you also is what elections they would be conducting. So people get confused. They think that it is the State Election Commission and they would allow for or make the grounds for the election of the state assemblies. I have seen many people that they are confused between this. Please understand, for any such state elections or the union elections, it is the Election Commission of India for the mere purpose of panchayats and the municipalities. 243K was added, and I am sure you have read about the amendments that was made. By which Constitutional Amendment Act, I must not tell you, you must remember it. There was a Constitutional Amendment Act that was done and these articles were inserted and it was given a constitutional status. Now I want you to take through PESA. Very important, and I would want you to write something now. But before that, just understand few things. Why would this Panchayat Extension to Scheduled Areas Act would come? Panchayat Extension to Scheduled Areas, be very particular about the words. It says about Panchayat Extension to Scheduled Areas. Scheduled areas for the matter of PESA means the scheduled areas as we have talked about in the 5th schedule. These scheduled areas are not in the northeastern block of the country, or these are not the northeastern states. So this PESA would come in for extending the provisions of Panchayat to the scheduled areas. This you can understand. PESA, and that was 1996. Very important for this year. I am sure you can calculate why it is important. So the provisions of the Panchayat to extend to the scheduled areas, Panchayats are mentioned in which part? Part 9 of the Constitution. So extension of part 9 of the Constitution to the scheduled areas is the mere purpose of PESA. I hope you got this point. Now since I have talked about part 9, I must also talk about, I have already given you a list of part 1 to part 8, suppose I have already given you, and you can just recall it. Part 8 where we ended was the union territories. Then please see part 9 of the Constitution, as I have already said, it is the Panchayats. The Panchayats. Very easy question if it comes, just maybe which are the pairs which are correctly matched. 10, there, or before this 10 there would be 9A also that would come in amendment because of the amendment, and that would be after this Panchayat there would be municipalities. Municipalities 9A, then there would be part, one more addition was done, part 9, part 9A, then would come part 9B, again an amendment was done. Do let me know which amendment would add part 9B, and the subject of it would be cooperative societies. Part 9B. Then there would be part 10 of the Constitution. Part 10 of the Constitution that we talked about the schedule and the tribal areas. The schedule and the tribal areas. Then part 11. Part 11 will talk about what is the relationship for the exchanges or the relations between the union and states. Part 11 will talk about relations between union and the states. 12, finance, and some other things are also mentioned in this finance. This is not as important. 11 is important, 10 is important, and this I suppose you all remember. Then you also have, after part 12 finance, related to this finance only a word would come. Part 13, that would be related to trade. It would be related to trade. So after part 12 finance, it would be part 13 trade, and maybe exchanges, or maybe we can say commerce, trade or commerce. Just remember the wording. Part 13 relates to trade, commerce, trade, commerce, part 13. Then we have part 14. Part 14 would talk about services. Services, part 14 would talk about the services. Part 14 very important. Then you also know about this part 14A. Part 14A, do let me know what amendment would come now. Part 14A would talk about the tribunals. Part 14 services. Now these services, like under the union or the state government, these services, part 14 it talks about the tribunals. Very important. After this part 15, very important, talk about the elections. Part 15 elections. Then you have part 16 coming in, not as important, but some special provisions are there. Special provisions for certain states. Part 15 you can remember for elections. Part 16 there special provision to special provisions for certain classes. It is, we can say, special provision for certain classes. We have seen the article in this only today when we say 342 special provisions for certain classes. Then would come, after part 16, there would be part 17. Part 17. So special, after special provisions, we will have the official language. Official language. Part 17, official language. Now this is very important. After this 18th one, very important, direct question. This relates to your emergency provisions. Emergency provisions, I am just doing a recap. 17 will be official, then 18 emergency, and then 19 not as such, some sort of miscellaneous, not important to remember this, but yes, part 20 very important. Part 20, I am sure you all know, talks about the amendments or amendment that can be done, amendment of the constitution. Amendment. Part 20 talks about amendment. Part 20 talks about amendment. And then we have a very important coming in, that will be 21. Now here we can talk about the special provisions. Special provisions. There we talked about the classes. Here it would be around special provisions for, maybe we can say, some entities like this in sort of states. Special provisions for states could be there. Some temporary provisions, for example, this article 370 and all would come here in this part only. 371 for that matter would come here only. And then this 22, not as important. This barely talks about this authoritative texts. Authoritative texts. Authoritative texts, or the Hindi, for the communication, or maybe how to have a law, it should be written only in English or Hindi, how it will be presented. So this is 22. But this is important. 21, 20 is very important. 21, 20 is amendment. 21 is for some states, you have seen there are some special provisions. 371 gives a list of it. Then we have 370. All sort of things you can have there. Then we can talk about the article, sorry, not article, but this after 19 one is just a miscellaneous one. Emergency, very important. In from emergency you reduce 3 from emergency and you reach 2 elections. So from emergency 18 you reduce 3 and you go to elections. You go to elections in part 15th. Just before elections you will have, now the tribunals have been added, for example this 14A has been added, but before that you had direct this services that is mentioned. In part 14 you had services being mentioned. So some of the parts if you get directly in the question paper you can answer it. Maybe like they could give you questions on which of the pairs are correctly matched. So this would be a very low hanging fruit if they give you this, and we should not do this wrong. This must be attempted in the right manner. This is very important. 14A is very important and they have asked many a times on this 14A. Although they have now shifted to philosophical connotations that come from the preamble and the fundamental rights, but surely they can ask you this also. They could ask you this. So as we were talking about, no, I want you to write down certain points for PESA as they could come. We still have few minutes. Please start writing, then we'll continue with this. Please start writing. The question that can come on this PESA is Panchayat extension to scheduled area. What are the objectives? They could try to give you statements and they would try to ask you, as you remember a question has already come, that what is the fundamental objective of this grassroots democracy or the panchayats? What is that fundamental objective? So for the PESA also, they could try to ask you a question on what is the objective, what are the objectives of it? What are the objectives of it? And if I say number one is, we have understood is extending the part of or part 9 or the panchayats to the scheduled areas, this is fine. But can we say this? The objective could be self-rule. Can we say that one of the objectives is self-rule? So definitely in the scheduled areas we have tribal population. So the self-rule for the tribal population, we can have this word, it can come into the paper directly, self-rule. Or can we say that? Can we say that it is also an objective to make participatory democracy? Participatory democracy, can we say this? Yes, why not? Since panchayats are extended to scheduled areas, that means the entities that would be made, for example, the Gram Sabha, it will become the nucleus of activities, nucleus of development, and this would be participatory because you can understand who are there in Gram Sabha. So participatory democracy. Can we talk about that this objective of PESA could also be sustainable development? This is a very broad one, you can easily write it down. Yes, sustainable development. Why? Why are we so much interested in scheduled areas? Because they could be treasure trove of many bounties, minerals. Development will have to go there, but that development cannot be at the cost of some rights or at the cost of environment. So sustainable development can be there. Or can you talk about, is this PESA for preserving the, can we say preserving the traditional rights? Preserving the traditional rights. Had this not been about preserving the traditional rights, we would have just given a law, we would not have made it a participatory approach. So important part is, yes, it is for the preserving of the traditional customs there or traditional rights are there, whichever customs are there. If also they ask you, is this PESA or does this PESA also has an objective of reducing concentration of power concentration of power. Does this PESA also has an objective of reducing the concentration of power at the upper levels? I think you can make this out even if they ask you this, that yes, if there would be a participatory democracy, that means the decisions will not be coming from top to bottom, but there would be flow of the request or the maybe all the sort of surveys, all sort of demands from the bottom to the top. So reducing concentration of power can be one. Okay, so let's end it here, because we will have to discuss about the Gram Sabhas also and some discussion on it. And whatever questions I have asked you, I would wait for your answers. And then after this, I think only few topics would be remaining, but my request to you would be, Saturday and Sunday we are not going to have class. We have this on Monday now. Can you do just one thing? Solve at least 10 years of polity papers as they have come. Just sit with your polity now and solve every question that comes in front of you of polity, and do not think that I have not studied yet. You have studied a lot, you have already been studying. So please do not tame your mind in such a manner that once I complete, then only I will give the test. This is a problem that we do. We feel that okay, I will attempt the comprehensive test once I complete all my syllabus. Now this will never happen. You can never complete your syllabus. We are not here to complete our syllabus. We are trying to be or become more accurate or increase our efficiency, because anything could be asked, but we want to just target, okay, if this is asked, we answer it correctly. Please do not wait for that time that we know everything. Start attempting the papers. For polity you can do this. Then we have suppose IR, you do for IR also whatever organizations or conventions that have been asked, and you do for geography. And these three if you master, I am sure then we have economy also coming in, environment also coming in. So just try to solve some papers in these 2 days, and then we meet again on Monday. All the best, and any such question do ask me, and my questions you have to answer. Thank you so much. All the best.